Oral questions. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Another day and another trade dispute with China and no tangible action by the Prime Minister. We've got the canola crisis costing billions. Now the pork sector in Alberta and Quebec are affected. When will the Prime Minister finally realize that his refusal to take a stand, to stand up to China, is costing so much to millions of Canadians? Mr. Speaker, we were informed yesterday by Chinese authorities that 2 pork exporters had their permits suspended. I want to clarify that these suspensions are due to administrative reasons. The CFIA is working with the companies to identify a solution. This is something that happens on a regular basis, and we are confident we will find a quick solution. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, it's not just administrative reasons when you've got 2 Canadians unlawfully jailed in China. Now our canola exports are being unfairly blocked, and we can add the pork producers of this country, who are those paying for the mistakes of this Prime Minister on the world stage. And what is the Prime Minister's response in terms of these attacks on Canadians' interests? Absolutely nothing. But it's worse than nothing. They're still sending Canadian tax dollars to the Asian Infrastructure Bank, which is run by China. So how many more people and how many more industries will have to suffer before this Prime Minister finally takes action?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Monsieur le Président, ce qui arrive avec what's going on with the pork industry is an administrative issue, and I'm confident that we will find a solution very rapidly. Mr. President, Conservatives are playing politics, and I would like you to know that today we have learned that the Leader of the Opposition is refusing to allow an independent check on the cost of their promises. So I think that the Conservatives are hiding the same way Dogford is hiding their very big cuts.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Canadians have paying for the broken promises of this government ever since the 2015 election. That will come to an end in October, Mr. Speaker. Another area where this Liberal government has completely failed Canadians has been on the energy sector. The Conservative record on pipelines has been to see the private sector build 4 major pipeline projects during our time in office. But the Liberals have vetoed and killed and now purchased a pipeline that they can't build. And Bill C-69 is the final nail in the coffin. More and more Canadians are speaking out against it. Will they...
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable member of the opposition is absolutely wrong. We are the government that gave approval to Nova gas line that has been completed. We are the government that approved Enbridge Line 3 that's almost completed on the Canadian side. We are advocating with the U.S. on Keystone XL pipeline. We are the government that has put in a process in place to move forward on the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion in the right way with the meaningful consultation with Indigenous communities, something they voted against, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Député.
The Honourable Member for Mégantic-Les Following 2 months of inaction on the canola file with China, we've now learned that the pork industry in Alberta and Quebec are being affected. And the Minister of Agriculture confirmed that she never spoke to her Chinese counterpart, that she doesn't know what the Minister of Global Affairs is doing, and that it's not time to launch a complaint with the WTO. The crisis is getting worse. The Liberals are refusing to even talk about it. How long will the Prime Minister let producers suffer before taking some action? The Honourable Minister of Agriculture. Mr. Speaker, we are talking and taking action and have been doing so for the past 2 months today. We are committed with Chinese authorities. We have had discussions on a daily basis. We have regular meetings with a working committee because we acknowledge the importance of the industry, we respect our partners, we respect the industry, and we are working as part of a team to take the best action possible to resolve this situation as quickly as possible. The honourable member from Mégantic-Les The problem is that China doesn't respect them because they can't take a stand and stand up to them. That's the problem. In a tweet from 2016 that was deleted, the Prime Minister guaranteed canola producers access to the Chinese market till 2020. It's 2019, and guess what? Canola producers no longer have access to China. It's unacceptable that after having made this promise to producers, the Prime Minister has failed so miserably. Instead of deleting tweets, can the Prime Minister, for once, keep a promise and stand up for canola and pork producers in Canada? The Honourable Minister. Mr. Speaker, I assure you that we are taking a stand, that we are taking action in different ways to deal with this situation. We are working in conjunction with the Minister for Trade Diversification, with the Minister of Global Affairs, the Prime Minister, and we have a great deal of respect for our producers and their representatives. That's why, once again, today we have the working group that is focusing on action, and we will continue to work with a great deal of commitment here and on the ground in China to resolve this issue.
Honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
This week, both the Liberals and Conservatives made it clear that they're more interested in working for rich corporations than they are for Canadians. With Loblaws and SNC-Lavalin, the Liberals have shown whose side they're on, and it's not on the side of regular people. In fact, the current Attorney General refuses to investigate the justice appointment leak. He seems to think that vetting judges through a partisan Liberal donor list is A-OK. So whatever happened to the rule of law, and whatever happened to the promises that the Prime Minister would do things differently?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, our government has taken significant steps to make sure that we have in place a process for appointing judges that is transparent, that is merit-based, Mr. Speaker, and that enhances the diversity of the Canadian bench. The new process is effective, Mr. Speaker. We're at 296 judges appointed or elevated at this stage. The diversity of these appointments is unquestioned. 55% of them are women, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to continue to ensure that our appointments process is merit-based, continues to be fair, continues to be open, and continues to attract the very best candidates to the bench.
Member for New Westminster Burnaby.
And how many of them are Liberal donors, Mr. Speaker? Now, they gave $12 million to one of Canada's richest companies. At the same time, women's shelters in Canada are having to shut their doors. Every day, on average, 590 women and children get turned away from overcrowded shelters that are packed beyond capacity. Many are forced to return to abuse and violence because of a lack of funding from this Liberal government. If this supposed feminist government is able to find millions of dollars for handouts to billionaires, why can't they provide funds to help women and children find shelter?
The Honourable Minister of International Development.
Just come back from a gathering with the founding members of Canada's shelter movement. An announcement was made where a study we have invested in is showing where the gaps are and where the opportunities are. To date, our government's invested in a child benefit that gives women and families more money. The NDP voted against it. We've invested in gender-based violence strategy with over $200 million to prevent this tragedy from happening. The NDP voted against it. We've invested in a national housing strategy with a carve-out for women and girls. The NDP voted against it. Our record speaks for itself, Mr. Speaker, so does theirs.
L'honorable député de Jonquière.
The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Across the country, women victims of violence are being denied access to shelters because of a lack of resources and funding. The Prime Minister likes to tout his feminism, but when it comes time to take tangible action to improve things for women, he's a lot more timid. Government inaction has left women in difficult, at times, facing vulnerable situations. Will the government give the necessary resources to shelters so that they can accomplish their work? The Honourable Minister. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to talk about the housing strategy. The YWCA Federation is very strong and has said that this is a major change for women and children. It's a strategy that will help 500,000 families and create 5,000 shelters. We've worked very hard, and we will continue to do better. The Honourable Member for Jonquière. Mr. Speaker, last week we learned that the Prime Minister's office is using a partisan database to look at the past donations made by judicial candidates. The Prime Minister seems to think it's necessary to ensure that new judges are good Liberals before appointing them. Well-connected friends have privileged access to the Prime Minister, unlike workers who need support. Can the Liberal government stop thinking exclusively about its own interests and those of his friends and finally work for Canadians? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, our government has put in place significant measures to ensure that the judicial appointment process is open and transparent and accountable to Canadians. These measures also encourage or enhance diversity on the bench. Under the new process, it's effective. We have appointed almost 300 judges and with unprecedented diversity. 55% of the judges appointed are women, Mr. Speaker. We continue to ensure that we have a merit-based process and that it is transparent.
Member for Milton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on August 5th, 2016, the leader of the Liberal Party received a confidential memo from Elections Canada detailing a long-term scheme from SNC-Lavalin to funnel illegal electoral donations to the Liberal Party of Canada. That list was never disclosed to the public until recently. On August 30th, 2016, SNC-Lavalin received a compliance agreement. There were many meetings with SNC-Lavalin in 2016. Can the Prime Minister let us know if that topic came up?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, these donations that the member is referring to took place between 2004 and 2009. Elections Canada operates independently of government and makes their decisions independently of any government. So the Commissioner of Canada Elections did do an investigation in this matter. 2 parties in this House were informed. Both parties have returned those donations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Milton.
One party hid the list of donations when requested most recently, and that wasn't this party, Mr. Speaker. The last time the terms SNC-Lavalin, compliance agreement, and PMO came together, we had 4 months of a drip, drip, drip of information coming out, leading to 2 resignations of ministers, 1 early retirement of the Clerk of the Privy Council, and of course, the resignation of the top advisor to the Prime Minister. Can they just put us all out of our misery and let us know whether or not the Prime Minister's office interfered in this matter with SNC-Lavalin?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, once again, these are in reference to improper donations that 2 political parties made over a decade ago. The Commissioner for Canada Elections did do an investigation. Those donations have now been returned. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the plan that we have, and we will put it up against the no plan of the Conservatives any day, what we know that Canadians are better off today than they were under 10 years of Stephen Harper. So, Mr. Speaker, we know that the Conservatives will talk a big game. What we will do is we'll focus on Canadians, and we know that Canadians are better off today because of the Canada Child Benefit, a measure that the Conservatives want to take away. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Député de Richmond.
The Honourable Member for Richmond North Athabasca. Mr. Speaker, on August 5th, 2016, we asked the Liberal Party and the Liberal leader for information concerning $110 in illegal donations they received. What did the Liberals do, as they usually do? They refused to provide the information. Why does the Prime Minister always wait to get caught with his hand in the bag before providing information? Why doesn't the Liberal leader simply tell Canadians the truth? Why doesn't he answer the question whether members of his office met with the Director of Elections? The Government House Leader. Mr. Speaker, these improper donations to 2 parties were made more than 10 years ago under the direction of the Prime Minister. We have raised the bar on transparency. We adopted a measure to ensure that the PBO can focus on these issues. Thanks to the important and nonpartisan work, Canadians can't be misled. Unfortunately, only the Conservatives have refused to provide an independent estimate of their expenditures. The Honourable Member for Richmond-Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, Canadians thought that after the sponsorship scandal, the Liberals would change. Now, what we've seen today is that Liberal culture is all alive and well and present in the organization. We're faced with a Liberal leader, a Prime Minister found guilty 4 times of having violated the Ethics and Conflict of Interest Act. The federal court is now calling for a review of the investigation on the Liberal leader's family trip to the Aga Khan's private island. Will the Prime Minister agree to reopen the file and collaborate? Yes or no? Mr. Speaker, we know that the Commissioner does work independently on this side of the House. We have respect for the Commissioner's work. The Prime Minister accepted responsibility and what the Commissioner presented in the report. When it comes to improper donations to 2 political parties, we know that the Commissioner for Elections Canada investigated. We know that both parties returned the donations. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, illegal, not inappropriate. Earlier today, Mr. Speaker, I wrote to the RCMP Commissioner suggesting investigation of the Liberal leader's illegal vacations to the Aga Khan's island. Recent confirmation of RCMP deep involvement in the planning of the vacations, as well as lingering questions involving the Liberal leader's behavior in the SNC corruption scandal, underscore the need to assure Canadians there is only one law that must be followed by all Canadians. Mr. Speaker, will the Prime Minister cooperate in any belated criminal investigation in his illegal vacations?
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, as we know, is that this matter has been thoroughly studied by the former Conflict of Interest and Ethics Commissioner. The Prime Minister has accepted her findings. The Prime Minister has accepted responsibility when it comes to this matter. And the member opposite should very well know that ATIPs are handled completely separate from political staff. And, Mr. Speaker, I shouldn't have to remind the Conservatives that they were the ones who were found guilty of politically interfering with the ATIP process. And it's unfortunate because they actually rehired the person that was responsible and was found guilty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we know the Liberal leader considers the exposure of each of his ever-accumulating ethical lapses as learning experiences. You'll recall the Liberals wrote answers during the Ethics Commissioner's year-long investigation, pledging his cooperation. But we all saw with the Justice and the Ethics Committees just how much the Liberal leader cooperates if he doesn't like where an investigation is going. Exactly. So again, Mr. Speaker, will the Liberal leader cooperate with a criminal investigation by the RCMP or the Ontario Provincial Police?
The Honourable Government House Leader.
When it comes to officers of Parliament and the independence of the police force, we on this side, we have the utmost respect for the work that they do. We will always cooperate. It's only the Conservatives that would have to ask that question, because we know that under 10 years of Stephen Harper, they had no regard when it came to officers of Parliament, and we know that the Conservatives have chosen a new leader, but they continue the same approach of Stephen Harper. And what's even more interesting, Mr. Speaker, is the Conservatives will do anything but talk about their plan because they have no plan. But we know that they want to cut the tax-free Canada Child benefit, and that's why today we find out that they don't even want to cost their electoral platform because they want to mislead Canadians just like Doug Ford did.
The Honourable Member for...
Alors.
Order.
Order. Order. L'Honorable.
The Honourable Member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. Mr. Speaker, the government this morning published its youth policy, which explains young people are aware of the impact of climate change and want immediate measures to be taken. It's high time they realize that, because there were 150,000 young people in the streets of Montreal calling for change. And emergency declaration was adopted in London. 6 months ago, I invited all parties to sit down and immediately adopt emergency measures for the climate. Now they're saying we have to listen to young people. Well, will the Liberal Party sit down with all parties so that we can work together to fight climate change? It's urgent. Let's go. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. The Conservatives need to have a plan. First of all, we've got a plan. A price on pollution. Action to stop the use of coal. Let's talk about young people. We are the party that put in place the first youth policy, the first youth council to the Prime Minister, 35,000 jobs, millions of dollars.
The Honourable Member for Churchill-Kiewatnook-Askey.
Mr. Speaker, while the Prime Minister fights for the billionaire class, First Nations in Canada are facing one crisis after another. Now we have word that dialysis units were ripped out of Barons River, forcing people to travel to Winnipeg with next to no support. And regardless of their federal responsibility, there's been silence from this government. When sick patients are forced to travel far away from their families, we are risking their lives. So what will it take for this government to move beyond empty words and act to restore dialysis services in Barons River now?
The Honourable Minister of Indigenous Services.
The Honourable Member for her question, Mr. Speaker, and our government is working very hard on closing the unacceptable gap that exists right now between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities when it comes to closing to quality health care. We are in the process of closing that gap. 52 new community-led wellness centres are now serving 344 communities, 218,000 requests under Jordan's principle, and we are working with Indigenous partners towards arrangements that would continue to support Indigenous control of healthcare delivery. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable Member for Chilliwack Hope.
Canadians might wonder why these Liberals handed over $12 million to Loblaws, one of Canada's richest companies, to buy freezers. Well, we've now learned that two Loblaws lobbyists, both frequent Liberal Party donors, lobbied the Minister of Environment and her staff. Then they met up with those staff again at an exclusive Liberal Cash for Access event with the Prime Minister. What a coincidence. When will these Liberals stop giving preferential treatment to their wealthy and well-connected Liberal friends?
Honourable Minister of Environment.
Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. 54 proposals were selected through a fair, transparent, rigorous process. There's absolutely no truth in what the party opposite is saying. But what Canadians want to know is why will the party opposite consent to having the parliamentary budget opposite cost their platform? We want to know how much it's going to cost or how much the cuts are going to cost Canadians.
The member for Chilliwack Hope. Order.
Mr. Speaker, only a Liberal would think it's fair to cost Canadians $12 million to give away freezers to a billion-dollar company that would have bought them themselves and call it an environment plan. But Mr. Speaker, it's not just rich Canadian Liberals who can get access to this Prime Minister. That American CEO also found himself at a Cash for Access event with the Prime Minister where he bragged about getting access to this Liberal cabinet by illegally obtaining a $1,600 ticket. Why do these Liberals only follow the rules after they've first been found to have broken them?
The Honourable Minister of Democratic Institutions.
As my honourable colleague knows, that in last year we passed Bill C-50 in this House of Commons to ensure that events that are fundraising events that are hosted with either the Prime Minister, ministers, leaders of parties or leadership candidates, that those events would be made public, the list would be disclosed. In fact, the Liberal Party began abiding by these rules even before the legislation received royal assent. However, the opposition did not do so. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lotbinière. Mr. Speaker, yesterday, the Prime Minister, in his Fimley response to my question, remained very evasive and miserly with details. The Minister of Justice will undoubtedly respond on the matter of made-to-measure contracts offered to devoted Liberal donors. A privileged communication dated August 14th, 2017, between a lawyer and the Minister of Justice turned into a lucrative contract worth $711 an hour. Mr. Speaker, this communication absolutely exists. Can the minister inform the House of the existence of this letter? The Honourable Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can have confidence in the granting of contracts and legal services. A diligent and responsible process is used. Contracts are managed by the Department of Justice, and the granting of this contract followed all rules in force at the department. The Honourable Member for Lévis-Lauvinière. Mr. Speaker, in the letter in question, dated August 14, 2017, it talks about conversations that led to a contract for services for no other reason than to plump the wallets of their Liberal buddies. It's as if the Minister of Justice didn't have on staff any lawyers who could have advised him. Mr. Speaker, the farce is over. This letter does indeed exist. It's time for the minister to show some backbone and confirm the existence of the letter. Canadians want to know the truth. The Honourable Minister of Justice. Mr. Speaker, the Department of Justice approves these. Several approvals are delegated to the Deputy Minister and to other senior leaders. The rules for the granting of contracts were followed in this case.
The Mississippi Churchill River.
Mr. Speaker, like many Northerners, Napoleon Bouvier in Lacrosse does not have access to medical care. And instead of making life easier for Northerners, the price of medical care and pharmacare is only going up for people in my riding. We can't afford to wait any longer. When will the Liberals invest in health care in Northern Saskatchewan so that every Northerner can live with dignity?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Interparliamentary and Northern Affairs.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague for her question. Healthcare costs is one of the things that we have all been concerned about in this country. That's why, as a government, we have launched initiatives to look at pharmacare, to look at how we make healthcare more affordable to Canadians, whether you live in the north or in the south. But in particular, Mr. Speaker, we've paid careful attention to Northerners. That's why we've now launched the Northern Strategic Plan and the Arctic Policy, so we can hear their concerns firsthand and act on programs and services that will benefit them.
For Vancouver Kingsway.
Recently, I raised the concerns of breast health experts who are shocked at guidelines that ignore breast density and recommend against self-examination and timely mammograms. The minister replied that she wasn't going to do anything because the guidelines were produced by experts. But in fact, the task force relied on outdated data and didn't have a single member with breast health expertise. Wow. If the minister claims her #1 priority is the health of Canadians, then how can she sit back and ignore health guidelines that will cause over 400 women to die every year?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, having lost my grandmother to breast cancer, this is something that I take quite personally. And I know that the minister does put the health and safety of Canadians as a top priority. The Canadian Task Force on Preventative Health Care is an independent arm's-length panel of 15 experts to develop clinical practice guidelines. And while our government provided support to the task force, its decision was made totally independently. As such, these are not official government guidelines. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Brampton North.
Mr. Speaker, Ontarians know that an uncosted Conservative platform means Conservative cuts. Cuts to health care, to education, and even libraries. That's why our government passed legislation to permit the Parliamentary Budget Officer to review
Order. We need to hear the question. Of course, the chair has to know whether it's from the rules and so forth. So members, please allow me to hear. That's why I need to hear the rest of the question to determine whether this is within the responsibility of the government. Members will have to allow me to hear the question. The honourable member. No.
Start again? No. Okay. That's why our government passed legislation to permit the parliamentary budget officer to review party platforms during election campaigns. That way, parties can't mislead Canadians and hide their planned cuts from them. Can the government House leader give this House an update on how our legislation has empowered the parliamentary budget officer to give Canadians more transparency during election campaigns?
Great question.
Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, I agree with the member from Brampton North that Canadians deserve to know what political parties are proposing and the cost to them. And that's exactly why the independent parliamentary budget officer can now cost party platforms. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, it's only the Conservatives that are refusing to have their platform costed. Mr. Speaker, the only reason can be is that we know that the Conservatives are following the lead of Doug Ford and want to keep Canadians in the dark. We know that Conservatives do not support the tax-free Canada benefit. We know that they don't support the increase to the GIS, and we know that they don't support home care and mental health services. These are probably programs that are on their chopping block.
Honourable Member for Lakeland.
Mr. Speaker, for months, First Nations, trade unions and provinces have warned that the Liberals' No More Pipelines Bill C-69 will block resource development. But yesterday, it got even worse. These Liberals will steamroll provinces, giving themselves unprecedented power over highways, passenger trains, recycling plants, and of course provincial resources like wind, hydro, and oil. Not since the 80s have federal Liberals pit Canadians against each other over resource development and put the whole Canadian economy at risk. Will the Liberals kill Bill C-69?
The Honourable Minister of Environment.
No. We will not kill Bill C-69. The Bill C-69 is in the Senate. I was very pleased to testify today to talk about the importance of Bill C-69. Unfortunately, under the previous environmental assessment regime that was brought in by the Conservatives in an omnibus budget bill that gutted environmental protections, good projects can't go ahead in a timely way because they all end up in court. We know that we need to have a better system. We have better rules to develop our resources in a way that protects the environment, that does proper consultation and accommodation with Indigenous peoples, ensures that good projects go ahead. We're going to continue to move forward and work with senators.
Honourable Member for Lakeland.
The reality is these Liberals will make it so that nothing is ever built again. They're not helping the environment. They're not helping Indigenous communities, and they're not helping resource development. 8 provinces and 3 territories oppose Bill C-69. Hundreds of Indigenous businesses and communities are against it. Economists, investors, big companies, family businesses, and municipalities all oppose it. And the hundreds of thousands of Canadians who have lost their jobs because of these Liberals, they're against it. So will the Liberals approve TMX on June 18th and kill Bill C-69?
The Honourable Minister of Natural Resources.
Mr. Speaker, we have put in a process to consult with Indigenous communities to move forward on the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion in the right way. We have said that once the consultation is completed, a decision will be made by June 18th. But it's interesting to note, Mr. Speaker, that if they're really serious about Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, they would not have voted to defund and kill the process that would actually get to a decision, and they should know about that, Mr. Speaker.
Order. The Honourable Member for Carleton.
The Chinese leadership has called our Prime Minister a name that is so insulting. You, Mr. Speaker, have ruled it is unspeakable in this House. I will put partisanship aside and say I will not stand for that kind of treatment for our Prime Minister, for my Prime Minister. So in retaliation, will the government do the right thing and cancel the $250 million gift to the China-controlled Asian Infrastructure Bank?
The Honourable Parliamentary I think everyone enjoyed that. Order, order. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance. Order.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. For over a month, it's been over a month now since we tabled our budget. The Conservatives are desperately trying not to talk about it. They won't stop talking about the Asian Infrastructure Bank. But France, Germany, Australia, Italy, and South Korea are all part of it because they want to have more inclusive prosperity around the world. All that the Conservatives are proposing, Mr. Speaker, is the same old approach of Stephen Harper. turning their backs to the UN and other multilateral organizations.
Member for Carleton.
Well, the Globe and Mail says the Asian Infrastructure Bank is part of, quote, China's One Belt, One Road policy of expanding its international influence through infrastructure. So pipelines, roads, and bridges built in China with Canadian tax dollars. But yesterday, it was revealed that buried in a previous omnibus budget, the amount of money available to this government to give to the bank is actually $480 million, not the $250 previously admitted. What is the maximum amount Canadian taxpayers will be forced to pay to China's Asian Infrastructure Bank?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Let's be clear, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about $250 million over 5 years. It was a year and a half ago that this was announced, and we're going to be participating just like Germany, France, the UK, Australia, and other countries, because we believe that organizations like the Asian Infrastructure Bank, like the World Bank, like the IMF, are important multilateral institutions that serve global prosperity for everyone. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
A 68-year-old man with an amputation wasn't allowed to bring the batteries for his scooter on an airplane, ruining his once-in-a-lifetime trip to celebrate his wedding anniversary. He went to great lengths to have the paperwork approving the batteries in advance, yet to no avail. The problem is, this won't be fixed under the proposed Accessibility Act. It exempts Canadian transportation. So will the minister stand up and tell people living with disabilities and their families what they're going to do to fix it so that this never happens again?
Minister for Accessibility.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the honourable member for the question, which in fact unfortunately is based in error. I can assure all Canadians that transportation is in fact a priority under the Accessible Canada Act, with given an extended mandate to CTA to ensure that accessible transportation regulations come into force immediately. In fact, I thank my honourable colleague, the Minister of Transport, for being the first to adopt Accessible Canada regulations for transportation.
The Honourable Member for Cowichan-Malahat-Langford.
Mr. Speaker, life is increasingly unaffordable for people on Vancouver Island. Just like the Conservatives before them, this Liberal government is siding with the richest corporations while people pay the price. The good times just keep rolling for corporate lobbyists. The Liberals maintain the Conservatives' billion-dollar subsidies to oil companies. They cater to SNC-Lavalin and threw money at Loblaws. Mr. Speaker, people deserve a government that's on their side. So my question is this: when exactly are the Liberals going to grow a backbone and stop bending to the will of large and powerful corporations?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Finance.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure to remind the member that if he paid close attention to Statistics Canada's release lately, he would have seen that we reduced in the short 3.5 years we've been in power, we've reduced poverty by 20% in Canada. Wow. And if we talk about child poverty, it's 40%, Mr. Speaker, through investments like the Canada Child Benefit, like investments in housing, like investments in seniors, Mr. Speaker, and vulnerable seniors, all measures both parties on the other side voted against. Thank you.
Wow. Member for Niagara West.
Mr. Speaker, China has blocked Canadian canola for reasons that are both false and baseless. But the Prime Minister has yet to launch a trade complaint. China has also unlawfully detained 2 Canadians, and Canada has no ambassador to help with the negotiations. Will the Prime Minister stop letting Canada get pushed around, appoint an ambassador to China, and launch a formal trade complaint to resolve the canola crisis?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Speaker, first of all, I'd like to say, most importantly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs is in close contact with the families of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. This is not about grandstanding or scoring points. It's about working persistently, carefully, and resolutely to bring them home safely. We've rallied an unprecedented number of countries around the world in support of Canada's support. For instance, Australia, the EU, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Spain, Denmark, the United States, and 140 international scholars and
The Honourable Member for Red Deer Mountain View.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This morning we learned that China is now refusing shipments of pork from a plant in Red Deer. a plant that employs more than 1,600 people. The same company has another plant in Canada which has also had its export permit for pork suspended. Canadians can no longer afford to pay the high price of this total Liberal incompetence and bungling on the world stage. When will the Prime Minister finally stand up for Canadian farmers and their families by putting an end to these politically motivated trade actions?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture.
Monsieur le Président, nous avons... Mr. Speaker, yesterday we were informed that Chinese authorities had suspended export permits for 2 Canadian pork exporters. We were clearly informed that this had to do with administrative considerations, which does happen relatively regularly in various sectors in various countries. The CFIA is monitoring the situation, and we hope that it will be resolved quickly.
The member for Durham.
Mr. Speaker, Canadian citizens are being mistreated in Chinese prisons. Our canola farmers have already lost $1 billion. Now pork producers are being targeted by China. Over the last 4 months, despite our requests, the Liberal government has refused to make senior-level calls. They've ignored calls to send a special envoy. They've delayed announcing or nominating a new ambassador. And today, they've said they won't bring a trade action. Mr. Speaker, China thinks our Prime Minister is weak, and he's proving them right. When will they appoint an ambassador?
The Honourable Minister of International Trade Diversification.
I'm very glad to remind members opposite of what the Premier of Saskatchewan had to say yesterday about the plan we announced to support canola producers. He said the federal government has shown that they do support Western Canadian agriculture. He said we're going to support the federal government in these decisions from this day on, as we have always indicated we will. The Canola Association supports us. The Premier of Saskatchewan supports us. Growers supports us. The industry supports us. It's only those Conservatives who don't support us.
Order. The Honourable Member for Sault Ste. Marie. Order.
Speaker, the Harper Conservative government made no attempts to address the impact that greenhouse gas emissions from transportation can have on the environment. There is no question that climate change is real and that we must act now. Could the Minister of Transport please update my constituents from Sault Ste. Marie on the progress made to make environmentally friendly transportation options more affordable?
Well, Minister of Transport.
The member from Sault Ste. Marie for his excellent question and for his tireless work in combating climate change. We know as Liberals that Canadians want to do their share in fighting to reduce greenhouse gases. That's why we announced for the first time as of yesterday an incentive, a federal incentive for those willing to invest in a zero-emission vehicle. Unlike the Harper Ford Conservatives who want to make pollution free again, we in the Liberal Party, we believe that it's important to take care of the environment for our children and for future generations.
The Honourable Member for Durham will come to order. The Honourable Member for Durham, wonderful voice, of course, but I prefer to hear it when it's his turn. The
Honourable Member for Charles-Bourreau-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, if the Minister of Immigration thinks that his government has a good record on immigration, he's mistaken. They failed to sort out the Safe Third Country Agreement. They sacrificed Canadian sovereignty by signing the Global Compact for Migration. They failed to fix the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, and they haven't compensated provinces for the cost of those mistakes. And I could go on. Does the minister still think that we're un-Canadian, or is he open to having a civilized conversation on the subject with us? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, in the end, the Conservatives saw that it's important to consult Canadians, but they didn't listen when it came to immigration in Canada. They think that immigration is a negative force, but on this side of the House, we know that immigration is a force for good and for economic growth in this country. If you look at our Global Innovation Skills Fund, that helped create 150,000 jobs in this country. We know that immigration is important for the economy and for communities.
No.
The Honourable Member for Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Order. Mr. Speaker, the government still has no plan to deal with labour shortages in rural areas, despite the devastating consequences on local businesses. Everyone agrees that immigration is one of the solutions. Complications and delays in processing these cases are unacceptable. The Quebec government, meanwhile, has opened regional offices. 2 years ago, I called on the Minister of Immigration to follow suit and to open an office in Abitibi-Témiscamingue. Why does the minister treat rural residents like second-class citizens when it comes to offering them services? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Mr. Speaker, we know that immigration is an important aspect when it comes to growing the economy across Canada. That's the case in Quebec as well. We know that customer service is an important aspect of this, and that we need agents across the country to help with that. We are working tirelessly with the province of Quebec to help solve the problem of labour shortages in that province and elsewhere. Immigration is important for economic growth in Quebec and for all of Canada, and our government will continue to work toward that end.
Member for Mission, Matsqui, Fraser Canyon.
Speaker, as we have seen recently in communities across the country, the effects of climate change are real, and they're devastating to our communities. Canadians want to know that we take these threats seriously and we're making the investments necessary to prepare for and to mitigate the effects of the next time disaster strikes. Could the Prime Minister or the Minister of Infrastructure of Communities please update this House on the investments that the government is making to tackle climate change, particularly in British Columbia?
The Honourable Minister of Infrastructure.
I want to thank my colleague for his very interesting question, obviously. We have seen the effects of flooding in my own riding, and Canadians have seen that across Canada. There's nothing to laugh about when people are flooding in Canada, Mr. Speaker. Climate change is real, and that's why, Mr. Speaker, in 2017, we launched the Disaster Mitigation Fund, a $2 billion fund across Canada to help communities to prevent and adapt against flooding. That's why last week I was in the Fraser River Valley near Chilliwack and the Shishwa village to announce a $45 million investment to protect communities and family. Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to invest in Canadians.
The Honourable Member for Calgary Nose Hill.
Canadians support immigration when it is fair, orderly, and compassionate. However, right now, there are serious examples of unfairness and injustice in Canada's immigration system.
It's a mess.
Anytime anyone asks the Liberals to address these injustices, they are met with thinly veiled accusations of racism or lies.
Yep.
This is wrong. This cheapens the debate on how to fairly manage immigration and harms racialized communities.
So
will the Prime Minister finally address his failures to manage Canada's immigration system, or will he continue down this tired, destructive path?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Immigration.
Mr. Speaker, after 3.5 years, the Conservatives finally saw the merit in consulting with Canadians. Sadly, they didn't listen. They're twisting themselves into a pretzel to hide their secret plan to stifle economic growth by cutting immigration in this country. If you look solely at our global skills strategy, it has helped create 150,000 jobs across this country. When you take our economic growth plan into consideration, where 900,000 jobs have been created across this country, you see immigration is a key ingredient. We agree with that. Business agrees with that. Communities agree with that. The only people who don't are...
Hello.
Order. The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, there are families in Quebec who have been fighting 24/7 to save their houses. There are families who have already lost everything, and there are families who have been evacuated and who are wondering if they'll still have a home at the end of all this. Meanwhile, the Minister of Public Safety doesn't know if he'll directly compensate flood victims or not. Will the minister commit to compensating homeowners who may be forced to move out of flood zones?
Minister of Public Safety.
In terms of the programming that exists and has existed for many years called the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement, the compensation measures to cover losses as a result of flooding are first and foremost designed by the provinces. The provinces then submit claims for cost sharing under the terms of the program, and as the claims get larger, the federal share gets higher. It starts out at 20%. It could rise to 95%. The cost sharing formula already exists.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. I want to thank the Minister for his answer. But, Mr. Speaker, the Government of Quebec gave $1 million so far to the Red Cross to provide direct support for flood victims, providing them with first necessities. And they didn't drag their feet on it. We're asking the federal government to do the same thing today, to help people directly and immediately on the ground. If Ottawa can find $12 million for Loblaws, it should be able to find $1 million somewhere. So can the minister commit to matching the Quebec government's donation to the Red Cross?
Safety. The Red Cross performs a very vital function in responding to natural and national disasters. It is a very valuable partner with all levels of government in dealing with the real human needs that come out of these circumstances. The Government of Canada is in close discussion right now with the Canadian Red Cross about the benefits that can apply not just in one province but in several provinces in the current disaster, and we will have something further to say on that within the next couple of days.
The Honourable Member for Terrebonne. Mr. Speaker, we can't play petty politics when it comes to flood victims. We've seen the generosity of the public all across the country and Quebec. There was a lot of money given for various natural disasters, and we need money now. There's no time to lose. Will the Minister of Public Safety take immediate action to match the $1 million donation by the Quebec government to the Red Cross?
Minister of Public Safety.
Mr. Speaker, I think I answered that question very directly in the previous answer. This issue is under active discussion now with the Canadian Red Cross. From the national perspective, we obviously want to deal with the circumstances in Quebec appropriately, but we also have Ontario to consider and New Brunswick. There's also flooding in Manitoba. We want to make sure that we've covered all of the bases to treat Canadians everywhere with generosity and compassion, and we will.